Are you sitting comfortably? Then it's time to soar. This is the Riff Chord.
You ready to travel to Mars? Spaceflight in your plans? Then listen to today's podcast. Today I'm speaking with Canadian writer Elizabeth Howell. She's a contributing writer to Space.com, has an upcoming book about Mars travel, a journalist covering all the NASA missions. Please welcome Elizabeth. Good morning, Elizabeth.
Good morning. You.
Oh, good. Now listen, today's our first day of the podcast, the first moment we've ever done it. We just got it all set up, but I bet as long as this goes, you'll be the only guest who ever lived on Mars.
Until Mark Watney gets out there himself for real, right? So.
When are they scheduled to go?
2033 or 2035. And so I'm only going to hold that distinction for about, 10 years or so. So
Interesting.
Yeah.
If you watch that show, The First, where Sean Penn plays the astronaut, he's the captain of the Mars mission. And I think the year is 2033. So it's based on it's NASA, right? Who's managing that project?
Exactly. So the idea is, as you probably have heard, NASA wants to go back to the moon in 2024. So that'll be 4 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
That's 5 years if you're taking the end of 2019. Right. We're going to have people walking on there, a man and a woman at the very least. And then what they want to do is take that same infrastructure, the habitats, the rovers and all that, and as much as possible, port it over to Mars so that they don't have to do the same thing over and over again.
So are you saying that Mars will be almost like the moon will be a way station on the way to Mars?
That's the idea, yes. They want to do something that's much closer to home because probably you remember from the Apollo missions in the 1960s, yes. It took people about 3 days to get to the moon and 3 days to get back. To go to Mars, it's at least 6 months. Right. So it's good to know if something breaks that you know how to fix it and can even turn around and come home if you really, really needed to. Right. Because on Mars, it's not that simple. Long story short, without getting too complicated, the orbits of Earth and Mars are never completely aligned. Well, they're rarely completely aligned at the same time. So they're, drifting at different speeds through space. And so if Mars is out here and Earth is here and you need to come back, there's not enough rocket fuel. So you got to wait. Exactly. Yeah.
Years ago on Nova, I watched a documentary about one of the Mars, one of the Land Rovers that was landing on Mars, and they were really against this timeline. And I said to myself, what does the timeline matter? Just wait longer. And no, it does matter because, as you just mentioned, because of the orbits, because there's a very narrow window where it has to launch in order to catch Mars when it's close.
Exactly, and so many missions have been delayed over the years. I'm thinking of the InSight mission in particular. They found a problem in the seismometer, the thing that's supposed to look for earthquakes or Marsquakes. There was a leak, and they just couldn't get it fixed in time. So they said, you know what? The responsible thing to do is to wait. And to wait means you have to wait about 2 years or 18 months, depending on the situation. So it was a long, terrible wait, but they got their thing launched. That was a good thing, and it's working. So.
Oh, fascinating. So we just mentioned that you've actually lived on Mars. Why don't you explain to the audience what we're talking about and why?
So there's this wonderful place called the Mars Desert Research Station, and it's run by a group of people called the Mars Society. And the Mars Society is a group of enthusiasts, scientists, engineers, you name it, and some journalists like myself who just really believe in Mars exploration and its future. So what they do is they run 2-week missions in this remote area of Utah. And if you have been in some of the deserts of Utah, it does literally look like Mars. You have this red sand and these red looking towers, and you really feel like just walking around that you're in that environment. And so my university at the time, the University of North Dakota, had an opportunity for a bunch of students to go. So there were, I think, 5 of us, and then there was a fellow from France that joined our group as well. So we were multinational, a Canadian, a person from France, and 4 people from the United States, ages 30 to about 60 or 65, and all sorts of different types of backgrounds, which I think is what you need, because you need one person who can do public relations, which was me, but then I was useless when it came to cooking or engineering. I mean, things were breaking and I didn't know what to do. I just would sort of sit back and wait for other folks to take over. And you need able managers. So we had 2 of them, and they had a lot of experience. And thank goodness, because things broke, people got sick, people got tired, people got cranky, and that was only over 2 weeks. I'm thinking you really, really need to have good skills to manage a year-long mission or an 18-month-long mission, which you might need on Mars.
And do you think any of us would survive on Mars, or it's just too challenging?
It's really challenging. I think that you need a lot of training to do it properly. I mean, you have to know how to hike. I didn't know how to hike. I almost got stuck on a hill at one point. I would still be sitting there, or I would have broken my leg by now, you know. So, but I had people who were trained around me telling me how to put my feet and how to walk properly, but I had no idea. It's also good to know first aid. I mean, my first aid is pretty limited, and we had definitely a couple folks who knew what to do.
Right. Yeah, I'm intrigued by the whole Mars mission thing. One thing that really stuck with me when there was a private sector firm from the Netherlands that was actually planning. But the thing is, and there were people coming forward who wanted to be trained and prepare and go on it. But it's a one-way trip. There's no infrastructure to get you back.
Exactly. There's no infrastructure at the time being. And I mean, the mission that I had was very simulated, you know, in the sense that we were not wearing real pressure suits. We were working like astronauts, but it was only for 2 weeks. So the rigors of getting ready for an actual trip would be months, years, just like a real space station mission. And we didn't know with Mars One how that would work out at first. They were not giving us a lot of clear parameters about how they were going to be getting their people trained, how they were going to be doing their engineering, you know,
Right.
the rocket ships and the habitats and the life support and all that stuff that people need. And then the funding, that was another big question. At first they said they were going to run it like a reality show, which was an interesting thing. And then they were trying to find other funders as well, but there were conflicting reports about who was giving stuff when. And then as far as I can tell, they went dormant, although I haven't really checked into them in the last couple of years. So maybe another idea will come up, a better one.
Yeah. So has this inspired you to apply for space flight, or are you just going to continue writing about it?
I did apply for a space flight, and they kicked me out as soon as the civil service exam was finished. Now, I passed the exam,
Oh, wow.
but what happened was then they showed the applications to people, and I just did not have the experience they were looking for. So this is the Canadian astronaut application that brought in Jenny Saigi-Gibbons and Josh Kurtik. If you look at their resumes, you can see why they were selected and I was not. I mean, he's a fighter pilot, and she's this super amazing scientist who was selected even before she was 30 years old, and just really dynamic and really interesting. So, and they're lovely people. I've talked to them many times. I have no regrets about them being chosen.
Yeah. Well, that's great. 25, 30 years ago, there was a documentary that followed the selection process for the Canadian team.
Yes.
The one in which Chris Hadfield was selected in.
Yes.
Dr. David Williams, is that his name?
Yes, Dr. Dave Williams. I have his book underneath my computer. It's propping it up right now. So I literally have him supporting me at the moment.
And it always stuck with me. The panel interview had 12 or 14 people sitting around the panel, and, you know, the candidate gets in there and they say, you know, start selling yourself. And Hadfield says, I guess this is the moment where I get on my soapbox. And he very humbly, but very thoroughly went through his resume, and it was incredible, right? First, it starts with all his degrees, and then he's
got 50 of them, you know. So
well, exactly, and then he starts explaining that as a military pilot, I was the first non-American to be selected for the Top Gun school, and then I was the first non-American to finish first at that school. It was incredible.
And that's the thing, right? You need to have somebody who has experience working in teams, experience working in high-risk environments. And I mean, a fighter jet is just about as high risk as you can get. You need someone who's used to isolation, and you need somebody who ideally has skills such as parachuting and scuba diving and working outdoors. And I only had a subset of these things. I don't fly planes, for example, which would have been perhaps useful. But I did get to do it for 2 weeks, and it was a lot of fun. And I really see my role now as kind of bringing that experience to other people, because I've been lucky enough to try on a real spacesuit.
Right.
I did that at the University of North Dakota about 6 months ago now, which is really amazing. I've seen now 5 launches. We can talk about those later. Sure. And then what I try and do is I bring this stuff back to my students, and I bring this stuff back to the elementary school classrooms I sometimes appear in, and just tell them, you know, what do you think would be a fun thing to do in the space world? You could be an astronaut. You could be a lot of different things, because being an astronaut was what got me interested in space, and I've gone almost as far as you can go without actually going into space now. I'm almost 40, so I'm feeling pretty happy with how things turned out overall.
That's fascinating. I'm always I love watching mission control as the as the missions get underway, because it's just so inspiring to think of what it would be like to be on a team that has worked that hard and there's so much at stake. And to see how excited they are when it works, I love it. I love the camaraderie. I love the inspiration, and I love the science behind it. And there's a lot of people involved, as you know.
Yes, exactly. A great book to read is Adam Stelzner. That's Steltzner, and he was one of the mission managers for the Curiosity mission, which landed on Mars in 2012, and is, by the way, still going and still taking pictures and roving around and climbing a mountain and just generally being awesome. So no issues there. Amazing. And the thing is, he came into it. I'm not saying this with derogatory implications, but he was a punk, like he came into the industry and he just sort of had this idea as a kid, I want to try all this stuff, but I don't really know where I'm going, right? So he was trying a bunch of different things. He was literally in a band for a while. And then eventually he was driving home one night, a typical rock star type kid, and he's going, that's interesting. The constellation Orion is in front of me. I wonder what that's all about. So then he went to community college and then began working his way up. And all of a sudden, well, I shouldn't say all of a sudden, but now he's a Mars manager. And I had the privilege, really, of speaking with him about 3 months ago for a book that I'm working on. And I said to him, listen, you're now in charge of a lot of people that were a lot like you, sort of like smart aleck, not really knowing what to do. And he just opened up. He said, this is exactly what I'm thinking about, right? How to manage these people properly and to get them motivated and to get them working on this goal of excellence on Mars, essentially. So I really, really loved interviewing him.
Oh, that's really inspiring. I hopefully my podcast will grow enough that someday I can interview someone like that. That's fantastic.
Yes.
Elizabeth, you just mentioned your book. Why don't you tell the listeners about what you're writing about these days?
For sure. So I actually have 3 books. One of them is still in stealth mode, but I will say it's with a Canadian publisher, and it's supposed to so far come out in the fall, and it's related to space. So I'll leave it at that. Okay. The other 2 are with a US publisher called Skyhorse Publishing. Okay. So the one that I was interviewing Adam for is called The Search for Life on Mars, and we're going to be talking about all the amazing NASA and European and some other missions that have been trying to understand what Mars is like, because we think that there was water that was flowing across its surface billions of years ago, but then it all disappeared. And so the first question is why, which we're still working to understand. And the second question is, did life exist or does it still exist? And so we're sending a series of missions, including Curiosity, the new Mars 2020, and then later what's called a sample return, which means we're going to be taking a bit of Mars, bringing it back to an Earth laboratory and doing a lot of studies on it. So that'll be around, I think, late 2020s, early 2030s when that's all through. So really, really cool stuff. And so it's me and an author in the United Kingdom called Nicholas Booth. And if you look him up, he's done amazing nonfiction work about true crime in latest years. So he knows all about laboratories and all that sort of stuff. And he used to be a science writer in the UK in the 1990s. So he really knows, the history of space exploration and has all this experience to bring to bear. So the 2 of us have really enjoyed it. And the second book is called The Science of Time Travel. And that was my little homage to science fiction because, like many of us, I got into space and science and loving all those fields from reading a lot of science fiction. And I watched a Hollywood movie. That's actually what got me interested, Apollo 13. And it was not quite science fiction, but almost. Yeah. So anyway, this time travel book is going to be looking at a bunch of science fiction franchises. So we're talking Back to the Future, Bill and Ted, The Time Machine, to sort of think of those major franchises. And I try and touch on many of them, if not all. So that'll be coming out, I believe, in May. So it's May for the time travel book, June for the Mars book, and then in the fall, so far, will be when this Canadian space book comes out, but I'll have more details later on.
And what was the inspiration for the time travel book? Like, I love time travel sci-fi stories. I can't get enough of them. What was your inspiration for it? Or did someone suggest it to you? Is someone
suggested it to me. Like, sometimes you're in the right spot at the right time. And what had happened was they were reading some of my articles on space.com. And what I do there often is I take a science fiction franchise like Star Wars, which is coming out again this December, and I talk about the true science that can inspire some of the stuff that we see on screen or vice versa. And so they were looking at some of that stuff for Star Wars and Star Trek and A Wrinkle in Time and various other things. And then they came to me and they said, how about a time travel book? And I said, it's not my, if you want to call it in business, a core competency, but it's related. I can probably make something work, with the experience that I have. And so I just studied the franchises that I felt were appropriate and selected some scientific studies and other things to support what I was finding in there. And I just found it fascinating. It was really a good personal opportunity for growth. But for me, I also saw it as a really important way to bring in new audiences, because if you have this inherent love of science fiction and of just time travel, maybe you're going to get interested in the physics if I present at least enough of it for you to do some more research. So I'm hoping some 15-year-old or 13-year-old picks it up and has a bit of fun. That's my real goal. I don't even need to be a bestseller. I just want to have one kid, read it and then make a difference.
Exactly. So what is temporal causality?
I can't do that off the top of my head. I would need to look it up. See, the good thing about being a print journalist, I don't usually have to do this on the spot, but
exactly.
I can look it up and have an answer for you in 5 or 10 minutes.
It just always stuck with me. There's a contemporary movie made of the time traveler. Sorry, the actor, his name's escaping me, the Australian guy. But when he goes into the future, he digs into the archives of the rubble of the New York Public Library. And the futuristic New York Public Library is, the book catalog is a hologram of an artificial intelligence person, right?
Okay.
Welcome to the New York Public Library. Would you like the works of Shakespeare? Would you like to learn about, right?
Amazing.
The novel. But he says, I want time travel. And the hologram goes, temporal causality.
That's amazing. And I love libraries. I mean, that's how I got my start. So when I was a kid, I was growing up in a single income family. And when I got interested in space, I was marching back and forth to the public library, oddly using plastic bags. I don't know what our thinking about environmental sustainability was back then, but anyway, there I was, a kid with plastic bags. And they always were breaking because I had so many books in there, just stacked high of space and science and other things I loved. And so I adore the library. I actually live almost across the road from one right now, and it's the best thing. Whenever I need to research something, I just take a little trot, but not even 10 minutes, and then there I am. I don't even need to drive. So they really do make a big difference in a lot of people's lives.
They do, and they're great resources. And what the future holds for what the library will become is very inspiring. Like, my wife was shopping in a mall in Tucson, Arizona, and I sat in the Starbucks waiting for her. And while I was there, I borrowed an ebook from the Toronto Public Library and read it on my iPad, right?
I know, and the services they offer are awesome. You can do free language learning. They have their own Netflix at my library here in Ottawa that I can use there. Ebooks, obviously. One of the great things about the library that is close to me is it's nearby at least 4 or 5 schools, and it's almost attached to a high school. So people can just go right into there after school and take part in a number of programs. So they have, all these tables where people can sit down. They have tutoring, and then there was even a really nice moment. I think about a year ago, I was there around exam time for high school students, which is about January, and there were all of these little Post-it notes stuck around the shelves of the library. And it was like, you can do it. I'm almost there. Just really inspirational stuff. So they're even providing a community support for maybe those kids that don't have, the parents that are able to help them out at home for various reasons. So it was, it just was really inspiring. I'm like, that's really great at the staff. And if I had $1 million, I'd probably give it to a library. They're great people out there.
So let's talk about the Canadian space program. Is it called the Canada Space Agency?
It's the Canadian Space Agency. So you're close. Yeah.
And it seems to me we produce very effective, great people for space initiatives. I'm talking about Chris Hadfield. I'm talking about Julie Payette, who is currently our Governor General. Am I accurate in that, or is that just my Canadian view coming through?
No, you are right, because when I go and I talk to the Americans about the Canadian program, the tones I get back are respect. And I don't mean just in the polite sense that they're going, oh, this is a Canadian, I need to act nice. They say, we cannot believe the contributions that these people have made. And you can see it in other ways besides just looking at their resumes. They have been in senior management. I'm not just talking about Chris Hadfield being commander of the International Space Station, or Andrew Feustel, who is also commander. He's a Canadian astronaut who is with NASA. So not everybody knows that he's Canadian, but he is definitely Canadian too. So anyway, we've had 2 commanders of the space station that came from Canada, but we also have had a number of other senior management positions that have to do with space station operations and the space station program that came from Canadians. The current crop of new NASA and Canadian astronauts that are coming through and finishing up their training right now, that group was overseen by Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen, which was the first. So a non-Canadian was supervising NASA astronauts as they were learning the ropes, which takes 2.5 years to get ready for spaceflight, which is just super inspiring. And then they take on mission control positions, especially Capcom. They do spacewalk support, and they're just great ambassadors as well. You know, they'll show up at meetings and they will just talk to people about the space community. And I'm not just talking about, you know, going to kids' schools and signing autographs, which is of course important, but they also attend policy meetings. And they're there sort of as that lived experience person, right? So they are really, really well-rounded and really, really well-spoken. And every single one of them, almost every single one of them has gone on to some amazing role in public service even after finishing. You know, we've had Julie Payette, who's the Governor General. We have Marc Garneau, who's been a politician for a long time. Chris Hadfield, of course, is doing his public relations work. And then various other folks have gone on to teaching or to nonprofits, to medicine. Dave Williams has a lot of medicine and sort of organizational background in that. It's inspiring, you know, like I can't believe it, you know, whenever I talk to these people. They're just so inspiring and humble, and the Americans love them.
Fantastic. And I imagine you've interviewed a number of these people for your work, right?
Yes, I've interviewed all of them, I think. Yep, every single one. Yep. Yeah. Except for the guy who was with Cirque du Soleil, Guy Laliberté, who went up as a space tourist. That was a bit different, obviously. He wasn't a government astronaut. He was a private individual who had enough money to be able to pay for his own seat. And then he went and he was promoting water security on the International Space Station. So even that was a philanthropic endeavor, even though he was not a government astronaut.
Oh, fascinating. Okay, let's turn to your travels to Kazakhstan.
For sure.
What is based out of Kazakhstan? Is that well? I'll let you explain. I have my own guess as to what it can be, but
no problem. So probably everybody remembers the space shuttle, right? That American spaceship that was bringing Canadians and many others into space for 30 years. Yeah. It retired, and the U.S. is very, very close now to having a replacement program. Now, you can't just snap your fingers and go, hey, I want another spaceship. It takes years. It takes design and safety reviews, and it's much tougher than designing even an airplane. So that's why, besides also funding and political difficulties, it's taken 10 years. So anyway, that's almost finished. Mm-hmm. However, there's still an International Space Station. They still want to staff it, and they still want to fly astronauts. And so they said, hey, this is an international program. The great thing about an international program is you have more than one partner with a spaceship. Therefore, let's go talk to the Russians. And so the Russians have what's called a Soyuz, which is a tight little, almost 60 styles capsule that does really well. You know, it's been upgraded and updated, and it does amazing things, and it's super reliable. Yeah. And so NASA was saying, what if we purchase seats on these Soyuz capsules, these spacecraft, and fly our astronauts up that way? So for 10 years almost, that's what they've been doing. Now, to be sure, they did it a bit beforehand, but now it's the only way that they can get people into space. So this brings in Kazakhstan. Where these things launch from? They launch from a place called Baikonur, Kazakhstan, the Baikonur Cosmodrome. It used to be part of the greater Soviet Union, but then the Soviet Union dissolved in the 1990s, et cetera, et cetera. So Russia now essentially rents this area and is considered theirs. You know, they're able to use the facilities as they need, and a Russian visa works okay in this area of Kazakhstan. So that's how come I went to Kazakhstan. I wanted to see people launch, because you don't see that from the US right now.
Right. Oh, fascinating.
Yeah.
And sorry, there must be geographic or mission-specific regions that they launch from Kazakhstan?
Yes. Kazakhstan happens to be fairly close to the equator, which gives them a boost. So when they launch, the speed of the Earth turning helps push the rocket into space. It saves on fuel. And another thing that's really good for them is that it's isolated, like super, super middle of the desert, nothing nearby, isolated. And so as the rocket goes up into space, it drops stages, which is very common. The Americans do the same thing. And then the stages just drop into the desert. And occasionally they've had issues. There was at least one that caused a brush fire a few years ago, but these are remote areas. So the risk to populations is extremely low.
Okay. And how's your Russian?
It's okay. I had enough about a year ago to go into a store and order things and to give very simple conversations with Russian officials. My favorite being, I was walking out to where the crew says goodbye to everybody before they go to their rocket and go into space. And so I was told by a photographer friend where the best place was to stand, and I looked and there was no one there, but then there were all of these guards, which is fair. It's a, you know, quasi-military situation. Yeah. And so he's there and he's in his fatigues and he's got his equipment, you know, and sort of trained to look intimidating. So I just looked at him and I said, "Tuda." And in Russian, that means over there. They have a distinction between there and over there. And so he looks at me and he goes, kto vi, which is who are you? And he goes, press, which is obviously press, like reporter. And I said, basically, yes, Canadian press. So I said, da, Kanadski press, which I hope is approximately what the right thing is. And so he's looking at me sternly and evaluating, and he goes, da, to da. So yes, over there. So I got to go and stand, and this place was absolutely perfect because I was watching a Canadian about to launch into space, David Saint-Jacques, and he walked from this building where he was getting his spacesuit on all the way up the tarmac to where I was standing, and I saw him the whole way because there were big crowds and I had no problem. So I had a camera and I just went like this and I panned all the way up to when he spoke to the Russian Commission with the rest of his crew. So it was very, very kind of this Russian man to let me go over and watch my Canadian go by.
Great coverage, and good capturing a Canadian getting on the launching pad. That's fantastic.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. I speaking of languages, I study Spanish and I've been doing it for 4 years now.
Ah, good for you.
Thank you.
Felicitaciones, as you would say in Spanish, I think, or approximately. So, yeah.
Gracias. Gracias.
Yeah.
I don't know. I would say my Spanish right now is about 30%. Like I'm like you. When I go on holidays, I can get by asking directions and ordering food and stuff. Hopefully, I'll get strong enough that I can do a podcast interview and we'll do it half English, half Spanish. But you know, I got so inspired and so I was loving learning another language so much that I thought, oh, I'm going to do another language after this.
Oh, so what's your next one?
Well, Russian has always been my first choice. I've wavered about whether that's really practical, and then I thought, well, maybe German's more practical.
I'll tell you how to learn Russian though, because probably people are going, how can some Canadian out in, the city of Ottawa learn Russian? Now there are programs out here. I'm lucky enough to live in a city that has universities and colleges and schools, and I can do it that way. But first of all, I'm fundamentally lazy. I don't like leaving my house unless I have a compelling reason, like seeing a friend or, going out with family or for work. But it gets cold here a lot of the year, and I just don't like driving in snow if I don't have to. So I'm going, well, how am I going to do this? Because I don't want to get up early on a Saturday morning and go to the school and learn Russian that way. I'm not going to be very motivated. So they have a lot of places you can learn online. And the place that I used was called iTalki. So the letter I, talk, and the letter I. What's great about them is that it's tutors all around the world that speak languages and are able to teach it to you with the help of textbooks and podcasts and other materials. And so I just said, I want a native Russian speaker who can also speak English to teach me how to do this. And I ended up with a series of lovely teachers. Most of them were in the Ukraine, actually. So it was really, really nice. And the last teacher that I had, we were together, in a sense, for about a year and a half, I think, until her schedule changed. And also I started writing books and I couldn't do it anymore. But she brought me to a point where I was even seeing progress within 6 months, because I went twice to Kazakhstan. I was lucky enough to be asked by the Canadian Space Agency to go and to cover the backup launch of David's mission. So he was not flying, but he was stepping in if need be. And so that was really, really cool, because he was hanging out with the reporters after his quarantine finished and answering questions. I saw the launch with him, like standing beside him. It was incredible. And then the next time I went back in December, my Russian was much stronger. I could just see in the way that I was interacting with people and my confidence and the ability to read signs and all of that, it really went up. And it was so, so helpful. I'll explain also how it worked with the CSA. So essentially it's an international expedition, and you can't just really go without a series of visas and approvals. So first of all, the Canadian Space Agency had a short list of reporters that they preferred. They wanted to have the bigger outlets there, obviously. So CBC, those other people were getting priority. But if there were seats, then if you were able to afford going and they respected your work, then you would have a chance to go. And so that's what happened with me. After they went through their bigger outlets, they had room, fortunately, and then they came to me twice. And then what you do is you pay them an upfront fee, which ends up being about $5,000 just to go. And this isn't your flight to Moscow where they pick you up. It's exclusive of that flight. So they take care of you from Moscow to Kazakhstan and then back to Moscow. And they're taking care of everything, your hotel, your flight, any translators, the people that interface with government officials, all the behind the scenes work you don't see, like talking with the Russian Space Agency, all that's included in that $5,000. And you have to get yourself to Moscow, which takes about another 2 or 3, depending on how you're traveling. Right. So it was lovely, because it was like being part of a tour group, and all of your basic needs were taken care of. So you weren't worried about being stranded, trying to figure out how to get into a hotel and speak Russian with the officials there. Like, they took care of you. They did a great job. And they would partner with either NASA or the European Space Agency, depending on the situation, to make this happen. So a lot of people, were really making us journalists feel comfortable. And I and my friend Sean Costello, who also went twice, and other journalists were so grateful that everybody took the efforts to make sure that we felt secure and safe. And it was a fun adventure, but it was an adventure done responsibly, So we had a great time.
Fascinating discussion with Elizabeth about space travel. Now, it may seem like we're cutting short a little abruptly. I realize there was no thank you and no goodbye. That's because this was recorded as a longer conversation, and we're going to split it here for interest of length, but also because the topic turns from space travel to working as a professional writer. So thank you, Elizabeth. That was great, and you can check out Elizabeth's work at elizabethhowell.ca, and her Twitter handle is @HowellSpace. Thanks for listening to The Riff Chord, and coming up, we'll have more discussion with Elizabeth about her career as a freelance writer, and all writers should be interested in this. Thanks, you guys. All the best.